동네에는 고래가 한 마리, 예쁜 고래 한 마리. 그걸 잡으러 떠날까요? 쟤네들은 술만 먹으면 고래 얘기야. 야, 일어나자. 시간 넘은데. 여보세요? 계산. 난 고래를 잡으러 나왔어요.
야야야, 휴지 있냐?
없어요.
마, 개똥처럼 비우지 말고 휴지 없이 밑 닦으려고 그래.
Within the realm of post-war Korean cinema, a common narrative tool directors have utilized is to focus on relatively young characters in low positions of power, and see how these aimless youths both react to their environment as well as traverse through the grand journey that is life. These characters have an internal identity struggle, facing the dilemma of finding a certain meaning within their lives. This is brought upon by mental and urban alienation, cultural barriers and societal limitations, and authoritarian political regimes that unjustly dictated these youths' lifestyles. As the narratives of the films in this subgenre progress, these specific thematic ideologies come to fruition, forcing viewers to reflect on how these impediments cause characters to suffer their predicaments in the first place. Focusing this analysis within two iconic pieces of Korean cinema that serve as the epitome of these ideals, March of Fools and Whale Hunting are two vital coming-of-age college-centric films. Both films highlight the problems that the Korean youth had to endure, as well as make Korean citizens themselves reflect on their own lives and how they too were affected. Cross-analyzing both films, viewers can see how March of Fools serves as a thematic and narrative template for Whale Hunting, and how both aim to express the idea of the youth's search for meaning and how that search is hindered by the environment surrounding them. March of Fools rotates around the lives of the two protagonists, Byung-tae and Young-chul, two close friends and philosophy students struggling to find their path within the world. They get set up on a blind date event with female students of Hansung University's French department. Byung-tae gets matched up with the exuberant yet capricious Oh Young-ja and eventually falls for her. Young-chul gets paired up with Kang Sun-ja, who not only has a completely different and introverted personality, but also doesn't seem to like Young-chul as much as he likes her. Nevertheless, he pursues her throughout the film. The narrative kicks off after all these characters meet, examining the boys' relationships with these girls, their relationships with their own lives, and their relationships with the world itself. They have conversations regarding uncertainty about adulthood and their future, if trust is possible in the way society is structured, and their purpose here on Earth. The ups and downs of the protagonists, in essence, serve as the major plot points. The mood and tone of the film shifts darker as the films progress. It ends with Byung-tae enlisting into the military, while Young-chul meeting his demise by committing suicide, as he was unable to find his inner meaning and purpose given his current status within Korean society. To examine the narrative and its ideology, we first need to understand the historical context surrounding the film to properly comprehend why the characters feel or act in certain ways. March of Fools was released in 1974, which was quite remarkable given what was happening politically at this time. During the 1960s and 70s, South Korea's Park Chung-hee government authoritatively imposed rule, with many claiming that it was the most restrictive regime in post-war Korean cinema history. The lack of democracy caused many student revolts and demonstrations across college campuses. There was a significant amount of censorship enforced among South Korea's creative artists as well, with many scenes that evoked explicit government criticism to be cut and forbidden to show against the public. The reason that there aren't any explicit references to rebellions or unjust rulings of the government isn't because the filmmaker wanted to keep his film purposely vague, but instead because of Korean censors who cut out several scenes. For instance, the demonstration scenes were cut and replaced with scenes of college sports matches. The film, however, still does criticize and convey how the regime contributes to the obstruction for the youth's identities by simply examining the everyday life the characters go through. The subtext of student aggravation and rebellion simmers through in every scene, even though viewers don't necessarily see anything. For instance, take this early scene in the film where the two boys run into a cop and get chased by police for their long hairstyles. In 1970, the Park Chung-hee government launched the Samuel Undoing, which was a nationwide lifestyle reform campaign. One of the policies within this was an anti-decadence drive. The Korean youth, therefore, weren't allowed to have long hair or express themselves physically in some ways because of these policies. In other parts of the film, we can see Young-chul getting caught for violating the curfew. This is because, within the time period, there was also a restriction on the movement of the Korean youth. And of course, one of the most important examples comes towards the end of the film, where a professor slaps Young-chul across the face. The surprising interaction between a professor and a student summarizes the violent substance of such public morals and the bodily norms. The students respond to this act of public violence by Korean-style streaking, which ridiculed the government because streaking was one of the most notorious misdemeanors at that time. As explained by Han Sung-king in Rediscovering Korean Cinema, Korean-style streaking was satirizing Park Chun-hee's political system of Korean-style democracy. The use of a Korean style was a political rhetoric that concealed the absence of democracy in the new system. On top of the political restrictions, the cultural also aims to represent the suppressed voice of a nation of lost youth. One of the main issues that is dealt with within the film is that the way that Korean society is structured allows for no freedom and only restriction, and that most students' paths are already laid out in front of them whether they want it to be or not. Everyone needs to get a job, get married, and have children. Making the two characters philosophy students, the director intends to examine how, although their major allows them to search for the meaning of life, they aren't necessarily able to go through that life successfully because they can't make enough money or provide for their family in this capitalistic society. For instance, we can see this notion exemplified through this scene, where Young-jae initially refuses to marry Byung-tae when he confesses his love for her. Since he will be drafted into the military, and then only finish university, she will be unable to marry him because she will be an old maid before their lives can even get started. The way that Byung-tae's journey concludes is also an example of the director's criticism of Korean norms, in particular the notion that Korean men have to enlist within the military. Within his concluding scenes, we can see all the recruits beside him joyfully cheering in high morale, while Byung-tae himself is looking down in melancholy. The juxtaposition of his feelings reflect how the director feels about military service in Korea, as it's a bodily resistance of the disciplining regime. When Young-jae runs up to Byung-tae while he's on the bus, she emphasizes her true feelings, which in turn is a resistance to Korean marital norms emphasized in the scenes prior. This can be taken as a heartwarming ending for the two, showing how, even though he will enlist and follow the path forced upon by Korean-abled men, she will wait for him and they will live a life of happiness. At several points throughout the film, Young-chul expresses how he wants to catch the whale, which can be taken in as a metaphor for finding purpose and meaning within your life. The reason that Young-chul feels lost in his path is because he is discouraged in himself as he compares his own being to that of others. A mental isolation is prevalent because of his constant rejections, from the military, academic exams, and romantic involvements. All of these push him towards reflecting more and more on his life failures and his inability to conform to societal standards. He thinks that once he catches this metaphorical whale, his life will finally be meaningful. Unfortunately, the director concludes that, for Young-chul and for many Korean youths at least, this isn't necessarily possible. The way that Korean society is structured and functioning within the 70s prohibits this from happening. We see this when Young-chul commits suicide by riding his bike into the ocean. This depressing act, paradoxically, is the only way for the character to gain his freedom under the harsh political and cultural regimes. Young-chul serves as the radical examination of this ideology, that Korean youth are unable to find their way because of how Korea itself is structured. Byung-tae's journey concludes, however, on a more optimistic note, saying that it is possible for some. He was able to catch it while still existing within a structure, but his path and journey are still examined as clear criticisms. Within the March of Fools, therefore, the fools themselves are Byung-tae and Young-chul, who are students who resist against the nonsensical repression by their state. The film is powerful in its narrative and ideology because of this. Transitioning to whale hunting, a film taking place around 10 years after March of Fools, we see a new protagonist, also named Byung-tae, and also a philosophy student, struggling to find his whale and place within the world. In the narrative, Byung-tae is hopeless in his studies and romantic affairs, and because of this, he is very unsure of his identity. He decides to run away from school and disappear from society. This is when he encounters Minwoo, a homeless beggar who exerts confidence and charisma. He is a man living his life to the fullest and embodies the ideals that Byung-tae desperately seeks. Trying to teach Byung-tae how to live like he does, the beggar takes him to a brothel where he meets Chunja, a mute prostitute who is beaten by her pimps for not responding to her customers' demands. Byung-tae makes it his mission to save Chunja from her plight and help her return to her motherland of Udu Island, thinking that her rescue would let him catch his whale. In terms of the film's placement in South Korea's cinematic history, it was released in 1984, which was after the Yushin system and the Park Geun-hye government collapsed, which took place in 1979. Unfortunately, Chun Doo-hwan took power instead and put the country under harsh military rule. Student movements in Korea became an important driving factor in the political climate of South Korea, with many students and universities holding protests to restore democratic rule. Especially after the Gwangju uprising in May of 1980, where student demonstrators who were against martial law were beaten and killed by government troops, the notion of government rebellion and resistance was fresh on South Koreans' minds. Because of this, the film also has a message of political resistance that lingers in the background while the narrative unfolds. Nothing is explicitly told about these rebellions, but some minor scenes convey how they are still present. For instance, take the scene where a professor asks the beggar if he's an old student. As explained by Kyung Kyun Kim in The Remasculization of Korean Cinema Reading, the beggar is a camouflaged man who cannot easily reveal his past, a past that surely embodies a trauma. He might be a former student activist who took part in these protests, or maybe a person who at one point was lost in his path like Byung-tae, but eventually found his will when he removed himself from society to live like a homeless man. The other characters within the film are also vital in examining the cultural dilemmas that are faced. The mute character Chunja emphasizes how the difficulties endured under the rapidly modernizing and industrial life of the city causes one to lose themselves in the process. We see how urban alienation is tied into mental alienation with her character, as she is finally able to regain her voice only when she arrives back to Udo Island. Then there's the protagonist Byung-tae, whose mental alienation is similar to that of Byung-chul. Both characters struggle to fit in with norms imposed by society. By traveling across South Korea to Udo Island, however, Byung-chul is slowly able to find himself and his will. Although March of Fools follows a somewhat dark path for its protagonist to emphasize the plight for Korean youth in the constrictive society, whale hunting is somewhat more optimistic in its tone. By the end of the film, the mute character finds her voice again, the pimps let them go, and Byung-tae catches the whale in some ways, realizing that he will achieve his life's purpose by not saving Chunja, but instead just experiencing life, loving his friends, and himself in the process. Byung-tae transforms from a pathetic and aimless youth to a responsible man who is destined to acquire his adulthood. The director constructs his character arc in such a way to reflect that he has both faith and optimism in the youth to become the driving force for change in Korea's future. Through similar thematic ideologies, March of Fools and Whale Hunting are two revolutionary college films about South Korea's aimless youth and their search for identity in a politically and culturally charged climate. These messages transcend Korea's cinematic history, with films past the 80s to present day still exploring these notions. For instance, in the 2002 Jung Jae-un coming-of-age film Take Care of My Cat, we see the lives of 5 female protagonists struggling to find their place and identity post-high school. We see how they suffer plights under modern Korean society and how that rapid industrialization leads to alienation and a loss of innocence. What's captivating about this film is that we see a coming-of-age story from a female perspective. Another powerful film that has similar ideologies to March of Fools and Whale Hunting is the 2018 Lee Chang-dun film Burning. Similar to Finding a Whale, one character is obsessed with the idea of the Great Hunger, another example of the inevitable search for a meaning. So if you're interested in this subgenre of Korean cinema, I highly recommend checking out the films that were analyzed and explored within this video.